So we have 6 big ideas, my friends. Number 1 is that first and foremost is the idea of Ahavas Yisrael. We have to care about other people because of the inner spiritual qualities that every one of these people have. Number 2, that we have to serve God, not because we feel good, because we've internalized Judaism. And that only comes with heavy emotional lifting. There's no easy thing over here. Number 3, we should all be leaders. We have to take responsibility and be agents of change. And number 4, we have to stand up for our principles. We have to stand up for our principles and not compromise Judaism for what we have to not compromise Judaism. And number 5, we have to be engaged with the world around us, remain true to who we are. And finally, we have to bring the world to a tipping point of goodness and holiness. I want to tell you 2 brief stories. And maybe after that, we'll have a little time for questions. I don't know if everybody's sleeping by now. I have no idea what's going on. Could be you're all snoring away and you've had a good time, because I'm only seeing myself on the screen. I'm not seeing what's going on. But I want to share with you 2 brief stories, so to speak, and then we'll have some time for questions and maybe through the chat, however you want to do it. I have a mechutin. The mechutin is the outlaws. I have a daughter who lives in Melbourne. Her father-in-law is a wonderful man, my dear friend Sally Spiegler. He runs a program called Chabad of Rara, which is Chabad of rural and regional Australia. And he runs all kinds of programs in small towns in Australia to take care of the needs and interests of the Jewish people. And if you want to watch a great film, I think it's on Amazon Prime. It's called Outback Rabbis. It's all about the work. It was featured on Australian TV. Let me tell you, watch out. You guys are bored. You get locked up in your homes. You can't go out. Watch Outback Rabbis. It's a wonderful film about the work of Chabad of rural and regional Australia. Anyway, a couple of years ago, 2 yeshiva bachrim travel from Melbourne and they go to a town called Ballarat. Now, Ballarat is a town which is it's in the what's his name? It's a few hours from Melbourne, and it was once a place within Australia had a gold rush in the 1870s, 1880s. And you know how a gold rush worked. The Jews rushed there, and they come there, and everybody else is digging for gold, and they're selling for retail. And the Jews in Ballarat, they built a beautiful, beautiful synagogue. And today, there's almost no Jews left in Ballarat. I don't even know if they get a minyan on Yom Kippur, but the shul is beautiful. Built in the 1880s. There's other shuls. There's a shul in Melbourne built also during the gold rush. Stunning in downtown Melbourne, right next to the Parliament. A beautiful little shul with gold leaf in it. They wanted to show off, we the Jews made it. So they come into town and they visit a few Jews they know, and they decide to go look in the phone book to see if they can find any more. And a name pops up at them, Luria. Now, if you go into your synagogue and you'll look at the prayer book that we use in Chabad shuls, it says, according to the custom of the great Kabbalist Rabbi Isaac Luria, who lived some 500 years ago. So they pick up the phone, they say, we are rabbinical students visiting from Melbourne. We'd like to see Mr. Luria. Are you Jewish? He says, yes. He says, can we come? Would you like us to come visit you? He says, yes. He says, we're coming. They get into the motorhome, the mitzvah tank, and you know how they travel down the street. The music is blaring. The police are chasing. They're coming. They arrive at his house, and they knock on the door. And an old man opens the door, and he says, where have you been? I'm waiting for you for 60 years. And what is the story of Mr. Luria? His mother went into Auschwitz, hiding a young child. And when she realized what really Auschwitz was, she understood there was no way this kid would survive. So what did she do? She somehow threw him over the fence to a farmer who put him in an orphanage. And miraculously, she survived Auschwitz. And after the war, she looked from one place to another, and she finally found her son, and she decided she's moving. She got a visa to go to Australia. Now, Australia has a wonderful Jewish community with a tremendous amount of children of Holocaust survivors. But she didn't go to the phenomenal, great Jewish communities in Melbourne or Sydney. And she didn't go to the smaller ones in Perth and in Brisbane and Adelaide. She went to a place, she says, if the Nazis ever come again, they're never going to find me in Ballarat. And she told her son 2 things. Number one, she told her that you are a Jew. And number 2, you are a descendant of the holy Rabbi Isaac Luria. And on that day, Mr. Luria had his bar mitzvah, standing in his living room, and the boys took out the tefillin. And since then, he's visited in Melbourne and reconnected with Judaism. He's getting a little bit older. He has a little bit of Alzheimer's. But here was a Jew who reconnected. Story number 2. I think it's 2009, 2010, if I remember correctly. Prime Minister Netanyahu gets up at the UN and he makes his annual speech, which is always the same thing. Iran is a threat to the Jewish people, and it is a mortal threat to the Jewish people. They have the same intent as the Nazis, and they want to have nuclear weapons. And in the speech, he quotes he quotes the Rebbe, and he says, the Lubavitcher Rebbe told me that the UN is a place of darkness, and if you light one candle and you tell the truth in a place of darkness, you can transform it. Now, what was the backstory? Just after he finished the speech in the UN, he went to the 92nd Street Y, and he told the backstory that when he was a young Israeli ambassador to the UN. There was a member he had been a commander of Tzayeret Matkal, which is one of Israel's top commando units. Those of you know there was a Sabina airliner. He was that in 1971 or 72 was hijacked to Israel. I was a yeshiva student at the time. I remember from our yeshiva we could see this airliner, and he was on the unit that seized that airliner, took it back from the terrorists. So he was eventually the unit. Then he became a commander, and one of the soldiers, his unit, became a Chabad follower. And he told him the Rebbe wants him to come Simchas Torah. And Simchas Torah night, he comes to the Rebbe. And that was the greatest night of the year. And 12 o'clock at night, the Simchas Torah celebration, what would happen is all the Hasidim would go all over Brooklyn. They would come back to Crown Heights. And while they were out, the Rebbe would make a farbrengen. And they switched the room. And about 12 o'clock at night, the Rebbe would come downstairs. And the Simchat Torah, the Simchas Torah celebration would begin, which would go to sunrise. So Netanyahu turns up at midnight. And he's put on the front of the stage, and the Rebbe comes in, and the Rebbe walks in, and he walks over to what's his name? He walks over to the Rebbe, he taps him on the back, and he says to the Rebbe that I came to see the Rebbe. And the Rebbe says to see and not to talk. And for almost an hour, the Rebbe speaks to him. And what does he tell him? He tells him that he lives in a place of darkness, and he has to speak up for Israel, and he has to tell the truth, and he has to not be afraid. Netanyahu, when he mentioned the Rebbe many, many years later in the speech in the UN, he was referring to that experience. A day later, I pick up the phone, and I called a man who I became very dear friends with. You know, it's interesting when you write a book, you get to interview a lot of people. And when you get to interview people, you get special friendships that you never believed you're going to have. And I called up a man who had been I had become friendly, very friendly, with a man who had been the aide to 5 Israeli prime ministers, and he had been the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom and also to Australia. He wrote a very well-known book called The Prime Ministers. His name was Yehuda Avner. He since passed away about 2 years ago. He was a very, very special Jew and one of the great treasured friendships of my life. So I called him up, and I said, "No, Rabbi Yehuda, did you hear about Bibi's speech?" He tells me, "Yeah." He says it's causing a ruckus in Israel. Most of the pundits, you know, we have pundits, and we have them on Fox, we have them on CNN, we have them everywhere. They're always telling us what we should think about certain things. He says most of the political machers in Israel are saying, you know what? That Bibi is going to do something soon to upset the Chabad community. So to placate them, he mentions the Rebbe from the podium of the UN. Now that speech is always every year. The conference of the UN is around Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur time. So I called him a few days after. This all happened a few days after Rosh Hashanah. So I said to him, "No, Ambassador Avner, what do you think?" He says, "Davidol, call me after Yom Kippur." He doesn't tell me a word. So 2 days after Yom Kippur, I pick up the phone. I call him up. I said, "No, Rabbi Yehuda, I have no idea what he's going to tell me." He says, "I went to daven with Bibi on Yom Kippur." Now, we have to be truthful. Bibi is not the biggest davener. Let's be honest. But Yom Kippur, he goes to shul. Now, if you know where the prime minister's residence is in Israel, which is on Rechav Aza on one side and Rechav Balfour on the other, it's right in the middle of Rechavia, and about 150 yards from the prime minister's residence is the great synagogue. But because of security reasons, he can't go there. So we went to daven in a small shul in the neighborhood of Rechavia. Now, there is a traditionalism. Bibi has an older daughter who's Haredi, and of his 2 sons, one of them is Shomer Shabbat. He observed Shabbos. In fact, he was the number 2 in the world biblical contest. He's very, very well knowledgeable of Torah. But nevertheless, that's not what's important here. So Bibi went to daven in the small shul in Rechavia, and my friend, the Ambassador Avner, went to daven with him. And we all know what the most important thing in Yom Kippur is in the afternoon is the break. Now, Bibi didn't want to go home because it's a it's a security headache. I don't know if you've ever seen him, but for whatever reason, a few times I met with now a few times the last couple of years in his office with the groups and sometimes in the Knesset. He walks into a meeting with the Knesset with 20, 30 American Jewish leaders. He's got 10 guys surrounding him. It's just amazing the level of security. So to walk back in Rehavia, on Yontif, it's a pain in the neck. He stays in shul. So the ambassador is a man in those years in his 80s. He goes up to sit down and schmooze with him. And now we know something about politicians. They don't always tell the truth. But it could be Yom Kippur afternoon, or the break, they might be telling the truth. So Ambassador Abner turns to him and says, Bibi, finally they schmooze, they cruise, they're talking, they're this, they're that. And he finally turns to him and asks the question he came to ask him. He says, Bibi, ala Rebbe dibarte, you spoke about the Rebbe? And he says, Ken dibarte ala Rabbi. For sure I spoke to the Rebbe. He gave me my mission in life. This was a private, four eyes conversation, Yom Kippur afternoon. But why do I tell you these two stories? For important reason. Number one, what did the Rebbe tell Bibi? You need to be a proud Jew and you need to speak up for the Jewish people. And that's something we have to do, my friends, every one of us. We have to not be afraid of being assertive and being proud and being strong as Jews. And then the second thing is, we all know a Jew from Ballarat. So you say to yourself, I'm going to Chabad, I go to JLI, I do this, I do that. And there's a Jew around the corner who never walked in the door. And if Rabbi this one will call him and Rabbi that one will call him, he'll say, I don't want to talk to you. But if you knock on his door and say, come with me to a class, or you know that it's Passover and he has no Passover Seder, or you know it's Hanukkah and nobody invited him or her to come and light the Hanukkah candles, you know that that person is disconnected to Judaism, you can be the person to reconnect them. And when we stand proud as Jews and we connect one Jew to another, then we're truly going to one day usher in that period of time when Mashiach will stand together with us, that we'll stand together in Jerusalem with all the great Jewish leaders throughout the generations in a time of goodness and kindness, a time of peace and prosperity, and a time where sanctity and holiness will reign. Thank you very, very much. I hope you're all still awake.
Rabbi Eliezrie, thank you so much. As advertised, you were great. Before I want to welcome a couple of new new communities and rabbis who are on the session. But I just want to ask you and it's late. But you said you were going to talk about it. So if you could perhaps just talk for 2-3 minutes. You mentioned you wanted to talk about Chabad in Russia. And
I forgot about Russia. Oh, Gewalt,
I don't want to go too much longer, but also I want, before you give your answer, I want to again just announce that today's lecture is dedicated in honor of Dr. Jimmy Phillips to have a refuah shlema, a complete and speedy recovery. So give us your 2-3 little shtick.
A remarkable story, and I'm sorry, it's a very strange thing giving a Zoom speech. It's my first Zoom speech. I like to know how many people are still awake, but nevertheless. Russia is, as I mentioned before, the previous Rebbe set up a Jewish underground in Russia, which nurtured Judaism all throughout that time. I heard a very fantastic speech from the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. It was 30 days after the Rebbe passed away. There was a 30-day memorial service, and I was there in Tel Aviv. And he got up and he said that he was in the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service. Those of you who know his history, he was really he was in the Lechi. He was one of the major revolutionary groups, literally more revolutionary than Menachem Begin. But he joined the Israeli Secret Service, and in the early 50s, the Israeli government decided they're going to start trying to reach out to Russian Jewry through the embassy in Tel Aviv, in Moscow, which till 1967 they had relations with Russia. And they discovered in every city and town in Russia there was already a Jewish organization underground run by Chabad. That kept going, and when what's his name, and when the Iron Curtain dropped, so that burst out. And Chabad began sending many, many emissaries to Russia, and Judaism is flourishing today all over Russia, literally all over the country. And there's another important question, which is, how do we relate to the Russian government, what goes on? And the truth of the matter is, well, I don't like much of Vladimir Putin's foreign policy. The fact of the matter is, he is a true friend of Jews. And I've heard this story from two people that have both told us by Putin himself. I heard this from Rabbi Beryl Lazar, who happens to be, came down with the virus, but I heard today that he's doing much better. He's in a hospital in Moscow, the chief rabbi of Russia. And I heard this from another individual, Levi Levayev, who both told me I heard this story from Putin. When he was a young kid, living in St. Petersburg, basically a latchkey kid because his parents were working all the time. They lived in this apartment building, and the same entrance, it was a religious Jewish family. And on Shabbos, he would sit at the table, and he would see how this family lived and how they guided themselves and how their father was learning Talmud and eating chicken soup. So he always grew up with a love of Jews and appreciation of Judaism. So he is, while I am troubled by much of his foreign policy, when it comes to Jewish affairs, he's a protector of Jews. So we're living in it, and what will happen after he fades from the scene, that's going to be a very good question. But right now, the political environment in Russia is that of protecting Jews. Judaism is going through a mind-boggling renaissance. There's a lot to talk about it. We could have another lecture for a whole hour about it. It's an amazing story. First of how Chabad ran the underground in Russia, which I'm going to detail a lot in my new book, Undaunted, which is the story of the previous Rebbe, and how this renaissance of Judaism is going on now, which is explained to a large degree in my present book, The Secret of Chabad, which, by the way, a shameless plug, you can buy it on Amazon. So, but this is a remarkable story. Never in Jewish history has a country gone such a good transformation that today we have hundreds of rabbis all over the country from Novosibirsk. Let me just finish with this. I was in Novosibirsk. It is the capital of Siberia. Chabad in Novosibirsk has a 45,000 square foot facility. It cost $5 million. 80% of the money came from the Jews of Novosibirsk. And they have a school, and they have a shul, and a community center, and there's 1,000 Jews who are members of that congregation, have key cards to get into the building. Judaism is going through a massive renaissance all throughout the former Soviet Union.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Eliezrie. There's no question that the success of Chabad is tremendous, and you're one of the insiders, and I'm happy you were here to discuss it tonight with us with such energy. You could see the optimism, and I know everybody online tonight really enjoyed it. And God willing, we'll go out to buy your book, The Secret of Chabad. It's available, as he mentioned, by Rabbi David Eliezrie on Amazon. Rabbi Eliezrie, I forgot to give him the formal introduction, but he's the director of Chabad of Yorba Linda, and he's the president of the Rabbinical Council of Orange County in California. And he's the unofficial spokesman of the Chabad movement. So thank you for joining us tonight.